Okay, in this module, I really would like to talk about the impact of disasters and terrorist events and other types of incidents on historical and cultural items that we value tremendously in our communities and in our cities. We have libraries and museums, and they all are very valuable. And so, how do we look at them? How do we protect them? And what can we do for them? So if we look at this module, here's a perfect example. In Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, there's a national park there. And John Brown and others launched a resistance to slavery. They were captured, executed, and Frederick Douglass and the Webb Du Bois made it a center of intellectual movement and speeches, and it became a national park. It has repetitive flooding, itemized lists of items that need to be saved. They know when the river is rising. It's actually located where three rivers come together. The staff that works at the Harpers Ferry National Park know when this happens, we need to begin moving things out, so they have a list. There's no storage in any of the basement. There's flood hatches into the floors to let the water in and out. Water-resistant wood doors. There's less swelling with them. They have specialized tools for pre-placement, for moving things around and barricading whatever needs to be done. They've moved the electronics above the water line. They've trained the staff on how to do this, and they develop a list of where the artifacts are to be taken, whose house are they to be taken to, and how are they going to be protected while they're done. A perfect example of looking at very, very valuable artifacts, developing a plan on what could be done, and then protecting those artifacts during some, in this case, flooding, because they have three rivers that join together in this area. In other examples, the economic impact of historic preservation is about $4.2 billion, including generating 123,000 jobs in the state of Florida. In Georgia, the rehab from 92 to 96 created 7,550 jobs, and $201 million was spent. In 1996, tourists spent over $453 million on historic-related leisure and activities. So I ask you, does your town happen to have a museum, a national park, or some type of artifact that you think is very valuable? As if your community lost this particular item or building, would it change the culture of your community? And so when we're looking at historic preservation and disasters, we need to consider that. I want you to take a look at Saving the St. George. Built after 1894, there was a massive fire. It's named the St. George after the knight who defeated the fire-breathing dragon. It had a Paris opera-style marble staircase, mosaic floor laid by Italian artisans that were brought in. There was a lobby carpet with the St. George crest, paintings commissioned, had the town's first hydraulic elevator, considered a marvel in engineering in its day. Additions in 1922 made it the largest hotel in the country, showcase of art and culture, and the salvation of downtown South Carolina tourism in the 1920s. Heavily damaged by an earthquake in Santa Cruz, protracted one-year court battle with historic preservationists, certainly influenced by the loss of the Cooper House nearby. 1 year to the day, an arson fire, and the people went in, retrieved architectural elements, and put them in the rebuilt St. George exterior, and they basically built a mirror of the original building. If there's a will and a way, and the people realize the value of something, they're going to work on it. Lancaster, Texas, there was a tornado, and it was the earliest Anglo settlers in 1844. The first church was in 1846. First business in Texas, 1851. It was a drugstore. 1860, the post office, 550 residents by 1885. 1887, first newspaper. 1890, the railroad connected the town to Houston and Dallas. 97, first school. 94, an F4 tornado. Think of the damage that could happen in this community. It set aside the bricks of the buildings, which were obviously the buildings were destroyed. Key historic downtown buildings were restored and reopened within 4 years because they had a plan. Oklahoma City, land run of 1889, 5 major railroads, building boom 98 to 1906, warehouse, Ramanujan revival style, large arched windows over the lower floor, additional building booms. There was, very, very historic buildings. The Oklahoma City bombing happens. Timothy McVeigh is upset with the federal government, blows up the building. Today we would call that domestic terrorism. Rocks and buildings for up to 30 miles away from the building. Can't even think of the name. Office was destroyed in the Journal Record Building, formerly the Indian Masonic Temple Shrine. Built in 1923, staff sustained injuries. Nevertheless, they conducted rapid damage assessment. Historic structures now are also part of the crime scene because they had debris in them. Oklahoma City partners get involved. They start looking at the buildings and what they could do to restore them. The National Park Service gets involved, National Trust, American Institute of Architects, FEMA, the volunteer architects and engineers, and they're saying, look, these buildings are too valuable, we need to save them. 73 buildings on the National Register listed or eligible to be listed. Window damage, misaligned roofs, damage to masonry, sprinkler systems set off. Now we have water in the buildings. So we have a lot of water damage and we have mold in the building. Priority to 19 locations in one historic district. $40,000 planning grant from the National Park Service. Nomination for the Automobile Alley Historic District. Tax incentives to reduce rebuilding costs. What is current thought? Mitigate, of course. Structural, retrofit, for example, non-structural, develop an evacuation plan for treasures, but also plan for how to save what's left. Integrate historic preservation planning with disaster mitigation and recovery planning. How do we determine historic in our cultural value? Think about it. Historic property, any prehistoric or historic district, site, building, structure, or object included or eligible for inclusion in the National Registry of Historic Places, maintained by the Secretary of the Interior. Basically what they're saying is any building over 50 years old could be listed. Cultural resource, non-living examples of objects acquired and preserved because of their potential value as examples. Objects such as art, historic, scientific, educational are very important. The National Registry talks about at least being 50 years old to be listed on the National Registry. Historic preservation recommendations. Prehistoric plan, pre-disaster plan. You want to know what you're going to do before the disaster strikes. Knowledgeable damage assessment teams. Avoid changes to the structure. And then integrate hazard-specific mitigation measures. Avoiding changes could be critical. As an example, many buildings today, older buildings, when you step out the door, you step down on a porch. Today, the building code does not allow you to step down. So if that's the way the building was prior, the building gets a lot of damage, you may have to get a variance from the code to keep it the way it was. Written plans should include building maps, locations of artifacts, equipment, division of labor, who's going to carry what, where's it going to go, list of vendors, specialists, and backup generator, where you're going to get everything from. So we want to look at what we can do. So there was a community in Milton, Pennsylvania that really, I think, did an outstanding job. So the hazard was river flooding. It repeated every 2 or 3 centuries, every 2 in a century. Native American history every 14 years. 1817 washes away the building stone bridge. 1865 took all the bridges. 1889, 90% of Milton covered. 1894, every home, bridge collapsed. 1936, one-third left homeless, downtown flooded. 1972, Hurricane Agnes, worst flooding. 1996, post-snowstorm flooding, debris downstream. Man, I think I'd give up after this, wouldn't you? But they decided to try to make things better. They have a small river town in Pennsylvania along the Susquehanna River, a large historic district, over 700 buildings, 2 historic railroad depots, a visual catalog of American development and architecture from the 19th and 20th centuries. Historic features: commercial buildings, tree-lined streets, factory-sponsored neighborhoods predate 1880. So we began looking at it saying, is it worth fixing these things? What's the cost-benefit analysis? They conducted a historical architectural survey, identified 5 neighborhoods that were distinguishable, selected 30 represented properties, determined the reproduction cost for those buildings, determined the mitigation costs, what they could do so that the damage would be reduced, and surveyed their residents for their views using a detailed questionnaire to everyone in the community. Everybody was involved. Some of the options: acquisition, demolition, relocation, evacuation, floodproofing, structural diversion improvements, and stream channel modification. By the way, the picture there, the one on the bottom, is actually from the last time the city flooded. They had a major fire in a building downtown. There was nothing they could do about it. Pros and cons of the options: the option acquire demo, the risk reduction high, the impact to historic would be high. Elevate, was medium risk reduction and medium impact to historic. Wet floodproofing, watertight, was low risk and low impact to the historical building. Stream and channel, moving it, low and high archaeology was moving it, and levee, flood wall, medium and medium. So they looked at this and decided, based upon this, they could take some actions, and they looked around for money. Where they could get to do it, where they could find money. So they went to FEMA. They got technical assistance, historic preservation specialists, Heritage. They got National Trust for Historic Preservation, local historic association, state historic preservation officer, private foundation, corporate foundation. References to the slide content can be found in the chapter, and photos can also be found more about what they did at the FEMA website for photos. So there's an example of a community that took a proactive view of what could happen in their community and how they could go about making things mitigating things to make them better. And so it was a good example. So use this as you're moving forward the chapter. There'll be some other information to look at, but I think you'll find this helpful, a little bit helpful on historic preservation.